On Monday, we started talking about the Hebrew legacy, taking the city of Jerusalem as a symbol of the influence of the ancient Hebrew people in shaping Western culture and shaping the world that you live in, the cultural world that you live in. We started off, why don't I just go back? Can't hurt anything. I mentioned to you that a big part of the Hebrew legacy is a bunch of ideas. We won't get to those ideas today, but on Monday we'll start talking about some of the ideas that come out of the Hebrew legacy, ideas about nature and time and all kinds of things, which have become foundational to Western culture. But I told you that a big part of the Hebrew legacy is the Hebrew story. That, again, there are references to this story all over the cultural world that you live in. You don't have to walk too far to find references to events and characters and vocabulary that comes out of the Hebrew story. Your culture is soaked in references to the story, and if you aren't basically familiar with the story, then you miss an awful lot of things. And again, whatever you make out of the story is your own business. I said that on Monday. But you just do. You have to know something about the story to be able to understand the things that you see in the world around you. And so I started off looking at the Hebrew story, the story these people tell about their ancestors and where their ancestors went, what they said happened to them, and that kind of stuff. We had to start all the way back in ancient Sumer. And we talked about these groups of Abarus. That's the Sumerian word for these groups of people who kind of wander around from place to place. They don't see the value of city life and all that kind of thing, living in tents and with herds of sheep and goats and camels and that kind of thing. And how one of these Abaru groups kept his family identity long after adopting civilization, called themselves the Abarus, and that's the Hebrew people. I mentioned to you how significant names are in this culture. And of course, I know everybody's name is important. But this is a culture that puts a special focus on names and what names mean. And oftentimes the names are significant and interesting. Oftentimes names of characters change in the middle of the story because the old name no longer applies. And we started talking off with the man these people say is their first patriarch. The person who founds this Abaru group, who starts this family, Abraham. And I gave you just a brief outline of the Abraham story. And at some point we got to this idea of a covenant, a covenant relationship between this family, between Abraham and Abraham's descendants and God. And I tried to communicate to you quickly how this is the basic plot line of the story, is how this relationship is ever going to work between God and the people. And it's these people's belief that this relationship really is real. Okay. And I tried to communicate to you how unique that idea is in the ancient world, in ancient world religions. Well, eventually we got to Moses. And I gave you the build-up to the big climax of the Moses stories. Moses is born in Egypt at a time when the Hebrew people are both enslaved and their population is growing. And we finished up last week talking about that problem, the Pharaoh's solution, and we left off with Moses' discovery somehow, we're not told in the story, that he truly is, the truth is that he's really Hebrew, that he's not an Egyptian, and he kills an Egyptian. And again, I tried to communicate to you the psychological turmoil that's going on in Moses as a character in this story as he learns the truth and sees the people he's been treating as slaves no longer as slaves but as his family members. Well, Moses kills a guy. Now we're to pick up the story. And he's charged with murder. He has to leave. He has to go somewhere where Pharaoh's laws don't apply. And I think the last thing I had you write in your notebook was he heads off to what's called the Sinai. If we go back to this map for a second, you see this peninsula here jutting down into the Red Sea. That's called the Sinai Peninsula. Pharaoh's laws don't apply in the Sinai Peninsula. And it doesn't really bother Pharaoh that his laws don't apply because there's not anything there for them to apply to. The Sinai Peninsula today, here you have a political map of the Sinai today. It's still a pretty barren area. There's not much there at all. Not much there for Pharaoh's laws to apply to. Here you have a composite satellite photograph which shows the Sinai Peninsula. Again, this peninsula jutting down into the Red Sea. Over here is Egypt. You see the delta of the Nile River and the green agricultural region that grows alongside the Nile River. Up here you see the land of Canaan. Again, we start to get more green up here. Then here we have this very barren land of the Sinai. And there you have a pretty typical picture of the Sinai, named for the most prominent mountain on the peninsula, Mount Sinai. And there you see a photograph of Mount Sinai, or it's called Mount Horeb in some of the biblical traditions. Well, back to the story. Moses makes it to the Sinai. Pharaoh's army can't find him there. He meets a guy in the Sinai named Jephthah, who owns a sheep business out in the middle of the desert. Can't imagine that being very profitable, but that's the business that he runs into. He gets a job working as a shepherd for this guy. He ends up marrying the guy's daughter. Keturah is her name. They have 2 sons, 2 children, 2 boys. And life settles down for Moses. It's a very different life than life as a prince of Egypt, being a shepherd out in the desert. But he has his life, and he has a family. He has a way to provide for his family, and life kind of settles down for Moses. Until one day, in one of the most visually stimulating scenes of the entire story, Moses is out taking care of the sheep one day, and he looks over, and it looks like there's a bush there, and it looks like the bush is on fire. Later on in the story, we're told there's an angel hiding in the bush, and that's why it looks like it's on fire. But it looks like it's on fire, and it catches his attention. Like, that's kind of strange. You don't see that every day. And it just keeps burning and burning, or it looks like it's burning and burning, all day long and all day long and all day long. And Moses says, that's kind of strange. And he goes over to look and see what's going on with the bush, and that's when God shows up again. After 400 years now, God shows up again. And Moses hears the voice, right? And God says, Moses, I've come to tell you that I've come up with a plan. And Moses, if you kind of play along and you kind of picture him, almost stereotypically Jewishly, Moses says, well, it's about time. It had 400 years, you know. And God says, well, I've come to tell you about the plan because you play a part in the plan. And Moses says, oh, no. And God says, oh, yes, you play a part in the plan. And Moses says, what's the plan? And God says, here's the plan. You're going to go back to Egypt. You're going to go into Pharaoh's palace. You're going to go into Pharaoh's throne room. You're going to point your finger in Pharaoh's face, and you're going to say, let my people go. And then you're going to go to the Hebrew people, and you're going to say, okay, everybody, pack up your stuff. Let's get out of here. Pharaoh can't stop us. Let's just go back home. We're going to walk back to Abraham's old hometown and old homeland, and Pharaoh can't stop us. And Moses says, I can't believe it. We waited 400 years for a plan, and this is the plan. And God says, you don't like the plan. And Moses says, I don't like the plan. And God says, what part of the plan don't you like? And Moses says, the plan part. That's the part I don't like. Look, this is the best you can come up with? I mean, I got to go back. I'm wanted for murder back there. And I was pretty famous. I was one of the princes. And I'm going to walk down the street. Everybody's going to say, wait a second, that's Moses. They're going to grab me. They're going to haul me down to the police station. They're going to cut my head off before I ever get to say, let my people go. And now even if, Moses says, let's just play along, even if I sneak back into Egypt, I sneak into the palace, I sneak past Pharaoh's Secret Service agents, and I go running into the throne room really fast and say, let my people go, and I go running up before anybody can catch me. Then we enter stage 2. Then I go to the Hebrew people and I say, hey everybody, remember me? I'm Moses. Well, I was out in the desert with a bunch of sheep, but I heard this voice that says, we can leave anytime we want to and nobody can stop us. Let's just go back to Abraham's old homeland. They're going to say, you're nuts. Down in the desert with the sun beating down on your head, saying you hear a voice saying, we can't leave. Pharaoh will chase us down and kill us. And God says, look, that's the plan. Are you with the plan or not? And Moses says, well, If that's the plan, I guess I'm with the plan, but come on. And Moses says, okay, I guess I'm with the plan, but if I'm going to do this, you got to give me some stuff. And God says, okay, all right, that's fair, that's okay. What do you need? And Moses says, well, I need some tricks, so that when I show back up in Egypt, everybody will believe that I met you, that I talked to you. Because if I just show up and say I heard a voice out in the desert, they're going to look at me like I'm crazy. I've got to have some tricks so I can prove that I've met you. And God says, yeah, that's makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's see, we got a lot of tricks up here. Let's, here's a good trick. You got a glass of water in your hand, pour the water on the ground and watch what happens to it. And Moses pours the water on the ground and it turns to blood. Pretty cool trick. Not exactly the kind of trick you can do at cocktail parties, You want to see the blood on the carpet trick? A glass of water, blood on the carpet, not so good. And God says, yeah, okay, let's see. Here's another trick. Stick your hand inside your shirt. Moses sticks his hand inside his shirt, and God says, oh boy, you're going to love this one. Pull your hand out, watch what happened to it. He pulls his hand out, and he has leprosy. Leprosy is a disease where the muscle of the body begins to rot while the person is still alive. And in a very slow process, the muscle of the body rots away, then the bones fall off, and from the fingers and the toes and nose, the ears and arms, until that rot moves into your body cavity. And once your liver starts to rot, then that's it. And he looks at his hand, and it's it smells like garbage. Is what it is. It's rotten meat. It's a horrible disease, leprosy, and man. And God says, okay, now put your hand back inside your shirt and watch what happens to it. He puts his hand back inside his shirt, and he pulls it out, and he's okay. So you don't have to worry about the guy, okay? It's just a trick, all right? He's not going to walk around the whole story with this rotten meat hand, okay? Although it would be a pretty cool trick. Want to see a cook trick? Rotten hand, I'm okay. Rotten hand, I'm okay. Would be a pretty cool trick. And God says, yeah, that's kind of a weird trick, isn't it? Well, here you got another one. You got your shepherd's stick there. Throw it down on the ground and watch what happens to it. And he throws it down on the ground. It turns into a snake, right? And then when he picks it back up, it turns back into his shepherd's staff. And Moses says, well, snakes are still kind of creepy, but it's better than the blood on the carpet trick and the rotten hand trick. And at this point, I am playing it up, but you're supposed to be getting a little bit of a kick out of the story, okay? Because here's the comic relief in the story. This is how the story is being crafted here. This is the comic relief, okay? You got God showing up again, explaining to Moses what this crazy plan is, and then Moses asking for these tricks, and you're supposed to picture Moses, sticking his hand inside his shirt, pulling it out, and oh my goodness, what kind of a trick is this? And you're supposed to be getting kind of a kick out of it because the writer of the story here is setting you up. Because as soon as you kind of relax and have a little laugh about Moses and God negotiating what kind of tricks you need, all of a sudden the story gets really serious. Because Moses really doesn't believe this is going to work. He really believes he's going to show up in Egypt. He's going to say, they're going to grab him, cut his head off. That's the end of the Moses story. And Moses says, okay, I'm with the plan. I don't really like the plan, but I'm with it. But look, you're asking an awful lot of me. I'm going back where I'm wanted for murder. I got to leave my wife and kids out here in the desert. Who knows if or when I'll ever get back to see them again. If you want this from me, you got to give me something. Moses says, I want you to tell me something. He says, I want you to tell me something you never told anybody before. Moses says to God, I want you to tell me something you never told Abraham. I want you to tell me something you never told anybody. Moses says, I want you to tell me what your name is. Now, so far in the course, we've been using the word God to refer to personality that runs the whole universe. But if you think about it, that word God in English is kind of like a job title name. That word God means the personality that runs the whole universe. But it wouldn't be the person's name. Okay. Like this. If I said, the President of the United States gave a speech last night, you know who I'm talking about, but that's not the man's name. If I said, has your algebra teacher talked to you about quadrilateral equations yet? you would know who I'm talking about, but that wouldn't be the person's name. Okay, and Moses says, okay, I got this idea that you run the whole universe and all that kind of stuff. But I want to know who you are. I want to know your name. And Moses says, I want to have that kind of connection to you. I want to know who you are. And at this point, God says, you want to know who I am? I'm me. That's who I am. Now go do what I told you to do. But that very emphatic, I am me. I am myself. God says to Moses, you're not going to know me by slapping a name tag on me and saying, okay, now I know that guy. You're not going to know me in that way. If you're going to know me, you're going to have to be involved in a relationship with me as you do what I tell you to do. You can't just slap a name tag on me and say, now I know God. But that answer, I am me, and it's hard to do in English because in English we don't really have emphatic voices in English, okay? We emphasize things with our human voice, but not with our grammatical voice, okay? But in Hebrew, this I am me is I am myself, that's who I am. It's complete self-containment. I don't rely on somebody else to give me a name. I didn't have parents who gave me a name. I'm myself. That's who I am. I don't rely on someone else to give me meaning. I am myself. That's who I am. I'm me. That Hebrew phrase, because it's so awkward in English wording, gets translated in different ways as I am who I am what I am that I am, I will always be what I am. And all those things are correct translations because it's trying to say I'm just completely self-contained. That's me. That's who I am. And you aren't going to stick a label on me and say you know me. I don't rely on you knowing me to give me meaning. But that very emphatic I am myself, that's who I am, is picked up by the Hebrew people and taken as the name of God. There you see it in Hebrew letters, and I don't pretend to read Hebrew, but here you have it in Hebrew letters, and just to look at, okay. But that Hebrew name, that Hebrew answer, I am myself, comes to us in two ways into the English language. One way from Hebrew into German, and from German into English as Jehovah. The other way from Hebrew more directly into English as Yahweh. That name is picked up by the Hebrew people and used as the name of God. Who is God? God is the one who says, I'm myself. That's who I am. That's who God is. And eventually, as ancient Hebrew religion develops into Judaism, this name takes on a sacred meaning, and it's something that is not even pronounced within the religion because it's something sacred and holy, and you don't want to misuse it. You don't want to apply it to something and mishandle it. It takes on a separate kind of sacredness as the name of God. Well, to make not a long story at all, it's not a long story at all, but to make not a very long story even shorter, Moses goes back into Egypt, and to make not a very long story at all shorter, God's plan worked. Who saw that coming? God's plan worked. As crazy as it sounds, God's plan works. Moses leads the Hebrew people out of Egypt, right to the border of Canaan, and then the people cross over into Canaan. And that's when we enter, that's an event which is called the Exodus. I know that's the name of the second book of the Hebrew Bible, at least in Greek. But that word Exodus means to go out. Just like exit over a door means this is where you go out. And this becomes the central story of the Hebrew story. It's like up to this point, everything kind of points at the Exodus, and afterwards everything points back to the Exodus, where Moses leads the people out of Egypt into Canaan, out of bondage into freedom, out of slavery into freedom, this big event, the turning point and the climax of the whole story. That story is retold year after year after year in Jewish families, in the Passover, and there you see a Seder plate for the Passover as the key event. every year in the big Jewish holiday, the whole story is played over. Children ask questions about the story, and it's retold over and over and over again. Well, the family makes it back to Canaan, by now a very large nation. Yeah, that's fair. And that's when we enter another interesting time period in world history. What we call the time of, what historians call the time of the Judges. Where we have evidence of people living, but we don't have evidence of any kind of centralized government. And that archaeological evidence kind of runs parallel to the story that's told in the book of the Judges in the Hebrew Bible. That's the 7th book of the Hebrew Bible. Kind of a unique time period. And I'm not sure there's anything else in ancient world history like it. I wouldn't swear that it's unique, but I'm just not sure there's anything else like it. Where you have a large number of people living in cities, but you have an interesting political system. So far in this course, we've talked about a number of different political systems. We've talked about dictatorships with riverine civilizations. We've talked about Athenian democracy. We've talked about the Roman Republic. And now we have another interesting approach to politics, which is just not to have any. Not to have any kind of political structure at all. There's no king, no president, no legislature, no police officers, no judges, no judges in the sense of court system. We'll get to that word judges in a minute. I kind of slipped up there. But no kind of court system. No laws in the sense of speed limit kind of laws. Okay. Now, of course, there are moral laws about how you treat people. Moral laws about how you behave in society, how you treat people within various relationships, your neighbors, your friends, your family, and so on. There are those kind of moral laws. There are religious laws about what kind of food you can eat and what kind of food you can't eat, and different ceremonial washings to go through at different events in life and so on, and how to properly sacrifice animals. These people make animal sacrifices to God. Not human sacrifices now, but animal sacrifices, and laws about how to do that, and those kind of laws. But there's no laws like don't tear the tag off the mattress kind of laws. Not those kind of laws that kind of make sense to some kind of legislature somewhere. There are religious laws, there are moral laws, but not kind of speed limit kind of laws. Instead, the phrase that shows up over and over in the book of Judges is everybody did what they thought was right. Everybody did what they thought was right. The author of the book of Judges is remembering a time when there's no political structure, no government. And that phrase is repeated over and over. Everybody did what they thought was right. The theory here is kind of interesting. The idea seems to be that if you teach children how to behave, and you teach children how to relate to each other, and you teach children how to behave, and if they grow up, and if they just do what they think is right, then you won't need police officers in every street corner. You won't need a court system to deal with disputes because people will do what they think is right. So somebody owes somebody money, doesn't pay it back. Well, both sides will do what they think is right. Okay. And so you don't need speed limit laws, all right? Because, of course, if you're driving your car and you come upon a residential neighborhood, of course you're going to do what you think is right. You're going to say, this is a place where people live. There might be children playing in the streets or near the streets. There might be old people trying to cross the road. I should slow down to a reasonable speed. You start to pick up on some of the problem here? It doesn't really work. It's an interesting political theory, but it doesn't really work so much in practice. You begin to very quickly pick up on, I can see where some problems would come in. Okay. And as the story of the book of Judges unfolds, is exactly what happens. you have all kinds of problems until by the end of the book of Judges, and here's that crafting of the story, that phrase becomes very bitter and sarcastic. Everybody did what they thought was right. And by the end of the book, horrible things are being described. I mean, atrocious things are being described. And the last line in that story is, everybody did what they thought was right. In the next story, something horrible happens, yet everybody did what they thought was right. It starts off with this hope that everybody does what they think is right, and it ends up being very bitter and sarcastic. And as it turns out, well, there are times when it kind of makes sense to have a government. Especially, for example, we'll just pick one example, when the bad guys show up. The bad guys show up, they charge around the countryside, burning stuff and stealing stuff and killing people. And when the bad guys show up, then everybody has to wait. They have to wait until somebody stands up and says, I'm anointed to be a judge. Now, a couple things about what I just said there. First of all, this word judge. We'll get to that word anointed in a minute. I told you, this was Monday, I think, that this story's been told and retold so many different times, continually almost. And so old-fashioned uses of words have gotten stuck to the story. This word judge is an older use of the word judge in English to mean someone who's authorized to make decisions. Today, the first thing we think of when we think about judges is somebody in a black gown in a courtroom banging the gavel or something. We've kind of limited that meaning, but the original use of the word is just anybody who's authorized to make decisions, who has the kind of authority to make decisions. So the bad guys show up, they're running around burning stuff, killing people. Somebody stands up and says, I'm anointed to be the judge. That means I'm anointed to be the leader. Okay, anointed to be the one who makes decisions around here. That's kind of important, but this next part is really important, and that's that word anointed. This English word anointed simply means chosen to do a special job. Chosen to do a special job. And in this context, what it means, of course, is chosen by God to do a special job. Chosen to do a special job. So when someone stands up and says, I'm anointed to be a judge, what they're really saying is, God's chosen me to be the leader. That's what that means. God's chosen me to be the leader. Now, of course, these are pretty smart people. They know that not everybody who stands up and says, oh yeah, that's right, God chose me to be the leader, actually was chosen by God to be the leader. So there's usually some kind of testing process and a candidate process, and you get asked questions. How did you know that you were chosen by God to be the leader? Well, an angel told me. Well, how did you know it was an angel? Well, he did all kinds of angel tricks. Like what? Well, like this. Or in some way the judge demonstrates that this person really has been chosen to be the leader. There doesn't seem to be much of a pattern. There are old judges and young judges and male judges and female judges, and even one judge who's not a Hebrew person at all for some reason. But there's this process, and then when it becomes clear to the religious leadership that this person, in fact, it has been called to be the judge, then in a very simple ritual, the leaders of the big families among the people gather in one place, and somebody, usually the high priest, we use the word priest in this English word priest in this context, takes a little bit of oil, olive oil, maybe just a tablespoon, and pours it over the head of the person who is clear has been chosen to be the leader. And in that process of anointing, placing the olive oil on the person's head, that's the symbol that this person has been anointed to be the judge. And now this person has the authority to put together an army. That concept of olive oil being applied to the head is so connected to this word anointed that even in the English word anointed, the idea of oil shows up in the middle part of the word. The oint part of the word here comes from a Latin word that means oil. Just like ointment is medicine that's mixed into oil so it sticks to where your wound is, your injury is. It's the same oint as in ointment. Now this word anointed, again, doesn't mean olive oil, okay? It means chosen to do a special job. But the idea of oil is buried there in the word. Well, now there's a judge. And now the judge has the authority to recruit an army and train an army. And now the judge can go chase away all the bad guys. But it's not a very efficient system. I mean, the bad guys show up. They're running around the countryside, burning stuff, stealing stuff, killing people. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to, I saw this one that came in here. Somebody came in here and put up another one of these stupid things. The bad guys show up. So what are you going to do? You're going to consult your faculty and staff emergency guidelines. The bad guy shows up. What am I going to do? Bloodborne pathogens? Not yet. Hazardous materials. You know, that baseball bat he's swinging is kind of hazardous, isn't it? Shelter in place. Supposed to stay in one place so they can get me? Identifying potentially violent students. Now that's... He's already swinging the baseball bat, right? So that's not potential. Okay. Significant disruptive behavior that is threatening. I think that's pretty much what we should do. Okay. Ask the student to leave class for remainder of period. Could you please take your baseball bat swinging outside for the remainder of this period? Oh, but if the student refuses to... What has happened to this country? If somebody shows up in this classroom and is violently disturbing, if we can't figure out how to take care of it, we might as well just hang it all up. It's kind of like that, though. The bad guys show up, you got to go through this process, right? Bad guys are here, okay. Well, let's wait until somebody says they're anointed to be a judge. Okay, well, okay, somebody says they're the judge. Okay, well, let's wait until all the family, the leaders of the family show up to witness this event. Okay, the high priest comes up. Oh, where's the olive oil? I don't know, did you have the olive oil? Somebody had, oh, there it is over here. Okay, now we got the olive oil. Okay, now you have the ability to recruit an army. Now she goes out and she puts up posters. We need good soldiers in our army, and raise them, recruit them. Now we can chase away the bad guy. It's not very effective, not very efficient. And eventually there's a call from the people that said, we want a king. We want a king. We want a king around here. You know, maybe if we had a king around here with an army, then the bad guys wouldn't show up in the first place. And then even if they did, we'd chase them all out of here. We wouldn't have to worry about all this process. Just somebody shows up, causes trouble, get them out of here. All right? We want a king. In fact, we want to have a king because we want to be like all the other countries. All the other countries have kings. It's kind of embarrassing not having a king. Who's your king around here? We have to say, well, we don't really have one. What's wrong with you people? Not good enough to have a king? Well, you know, we just don't have a king. It's embarrassing. We want to have a king. This call for a king is incredibly unpopular with the last of the judges. And because he's the last of the judges, you get an idea where the story's going. A guy named Samuel. Samuel says, look, I'm the judge. You don't need a king. Everything's just fine. I'm in charge. Sounds like a good deal to me. Don't worry about it. And the people say, no, we want a king. And Samuel says, look, you don't want a king. If you get a king, then your king's going to put income taxes on you. He's going to draft your sons into the army. He's going to come up with stupid speed limit kind of laws. You don't want a king. You don't want. Just leave everything the way it is. And the people say, no, we want a king. And Samuel says, okay, well, let's see. You want a king? So who around here would make a good king? I know me. I'll be your king. And the people say, no, we don't want you to be our king because you have 2 sons and they're both bums. We don't want them being king when you're dead. And Samuel says, okay, you want a king, I'll give you a king. And we enter a time period that historians call the time of the United Monarchy. Although it's not going to sound very united at first. You're going to have to wait a while to figure out why it's called the United Monarchy. Monarchy, of course, refers to a government where you have kings, and but it doesn't sound very united at all at first. Samuel goes to a young man named Saul, and what Samuel does is very significant to the story. Samuel goes to a young man named Saul, and he takes a little bit of olive oil, and he applies the olive oil to Saul's head, and he says, you are anointed king. He uses the same language, the same ritual, the same element of the ritual, the olive oil. He replicates that ceremony for the king. You don't see why that's significant now, but you will. This concept of anointing is going to show up over and over and over and over and over again. The same process that had been used for the judges now is transferred to this new political position, the king. So now there's a king, a guy named Saul. But then Samuel goes to another young man, a young man named David, and says, oh, wait a second, you're anointed king. Takes a little bit of olive oil, applies it to the head, says, you are anointed king. Well, one way or the other, there's at least 2 different ways to read the story. Samuel has created a situation here because you can't have 2 kings in one country. They both have the exact same claim to being king. The same leader, Samuel, used the same words, the same ritual. There are eyewitnesses to this event and so on. This isn't going to work. What you have is a civil war. A civil war fought for 7 years between an army loyal to Saul and an army loyal to David. Of course, there are all kinds of minor stories involved in there, okay? But eventually David wins and becomes the first undisputed king of this new country, this new nation. I mean, Saul had been anointed first. What I mean is an undisputed king, okay? In a world history course, we'd have some more things to say about David, but first, he's the first undisputed king of this new country. Now, if you're going to have a nation with a king, you have to have a name for your country. Or that'd be really embarrassing if you were a king of a country that didn't have a name. How would you introduce yourself? You got to have a name for your country. For a name for the country, these people go way back in their story. All the way back in the story, they tell about themselves, about their ancestors, where they say their ancestors came from, all the way back to a story about a man they call their third patriarch. We talked about their first patriarch on Monday, Abraham. Abraham's son Isaac is the second patriarch. And Isaac's son Jacob is the third patriarch. They go all the way back in their story to a story of Abraham's grandson, a guy named Jacob, the third patriarch. In fact, it's a story about Jacob and his brother Esau, his twin brother Esau. Now, the Jacob cycle, the Jacob stories are back in the book of Genesis, the first book in the Hebrew Bible. And there are an awful lot of stories in the Jacob cycle. But at one point, Jacob does something to his brother Esau, which is hard for us to understand. It's hard for us to identify with. It's one of those things from the ancient world which is interesting, but it's really hard to connect to because it's definitely not a 21st century American thing. But, well, Jacob steals Esau's blessing from their father. Now, again, this sounds kind of odd, but it's a significant part of most Hebrew families' lives. I mean, if the Hebrew family goes through the normal situation, then what happens is as the father ages, as he gets older, when it becomes apparent that he's going to die soon, then in kind of a special time, the children of the father, even if they're adults, but they're still children, of course, come to see the father. They go into the father's tent. And the father says good things about the child, hopefully says good things about the child, points out good characteristics and good character qualities and says nice things, and then says a special prayer over the child. And, I mean, this isn't a 21st century American kind of thing to do, but, and that was like a closing off of the father's life. I mean, he may live for a few more months or something, but now the business is settled, and it's a special kind of time. Well, Jacob, in the story, Jacob goes in to see his father Isaac. In the Hebrew, it says that Isaac's eyes are dim. That means he's old. He can't see very well. Jacob goes in and says, "Hey, Dad, it's Jacob," and Isaac says nice things about Jacob, prays for Jacob. And then Jacob leaves the tent. And then he goes back into the tent. Remember the twin brothers, right? And Jacob goes back in the tent and says, "Hey, Dad, I'm Esau." And Isaac says, "Oh, Esau, it's so good for you to stop by." And says nice things about Esau to Jacob and prays for Esau over Jacob. I know this doesn't really mean much to us, okay? It's hard for us to connect to. It wasn't hard for Esau to connect to, okay? Because when Esau found out that his brother had stolen his blessing, he says, "I'm going to kill him." I mean, it's that significant. He says, "I'm going to kill him." Somebody runs and tells Jacob, "Esau found out he's going to kill you." Jacob takes off running. Where is Jacob going to go? Well, he's got some options, but he decides to go back to Abraham's old hometown, all the way back to ancient Sumer. All the way back, following the Fertile Crescent, all the way back to ancient Sumer, all the way back to the city of Ur. According to the story, he meets up with some of Abraham's relatives. They're his, I guess, third cousins. I never have figured that part out. Third cousins, fourth cousins, or whatever. He gets reconnected back to the Sumerian family, the family back in Sumer. He gets a job working for a rich guy. He becomes very wealthy. Jacob does. He becomes very wealthy. He marries two women. Between them, they have 12 sons and at least one daughter who's mentioned by name. But no matter how much money he makes and how much wealth he accumulates, and no matter how much joy he gets from watching his children grow up, he can never get past what he's done to his brother. Because, although I know this doesn't mean anything to you and me, but think about it. Playing a trick on your old blind dad and stealing a blessing from your twin brother, I mean, even if that doesn't mean anything to you, that's pretty low. I mean, even if it doesn't mean anything to you, that's pretty low. He can never get past what he's done. And so he decides, okay, I got to go back home. I have to face my brother Esau. One way or the other, I can't live with this guilt anymore. I've got to go back. I've got to face up to what I did. Either my brother kills me like he said he was going to, or else he forgives me. But one way or the other, I won't have to live with this guilt. And so Jacob, guess what he does? He sells off his property. He buys tents and sheep and goats and cattle, heads off into the desert, becomes an Abiru. By the way, you might have picked up on that. There's this other constant interplay in the Hebrew story. The interplay between civilization and the wilderness, civilization and the desert, civilization and non-civilization. Back and forth. Leave the city, head out into the desert, back into the city, leave the city, out into the desert, back into the city. This constant play between the civilized world and the uncivilized world. Well, Jacob heads back out into the desert. All kinds of adventures, of course. Eventually he makes his way back to the old homeland. He comes back in. He gets about a day's journey away from where Esau lives. He sends forward a servant with a message, and that message is, your brother Jacob has come to see you, and he wants to meet with you in the morning. That night, Jacob sets up camp for his family. He makes sure they have tents and food and everything set up and all that kind of stuff. And then he gets on his horse and he rides considerable way away. I forget how far away, but a considerable way away. And he sets up his own camp. As far as he knows, his brother is going to kill him in the morning. And so he wants to spend his last night, as far as he knows, his last night. It won't run the story. His brother's going to forgive him. Okay. But as far as he knows, is his last night alive. He wants to spend it off by himself. And so he sets up his own tent and whatever. And that's when one of the weirdest of all the weird stories happens. A stranger walks into his camp. It's nighttime. The strange man comes walking into his camp. And Jacob looks up and there's this strange guy walking into his camp. And he says, "Hey, what's your name?" And the stranger says, "What's your name?" Remember, names are important to these people, right? Jacob says to the stranger, "What's your name?" The stranger says, "Hey, what's your name?" And Jacob says, "Well, I asked you first. What's your name?" And the stranger says, "Oh, math major are you? Well, I asked you second. What's your name?" And Jacob says, "Look, buddy, you walk into my camp in the middle of the night, you're going to tell me what your name is." And the stranger says, "You know what? I don't think I'm going to tell you what my name is. What's your name?" And they get in a fight. Probably the strangest fight you can imagine. They're fighting over who's going to tell whom whose name first. Just about the dumbest fight you can imagine. Tell me your name. "I'm not going to tell you my name. You tell me your name." "Look, buddy." And they start pushing each other. They get in a fight. Fist fight. All night long. All night long. They wrestle around, punching each other. You got to picture, you've seen the old Batman TV series with the exploding bam, pow, pow. "Tell me your name." Bam, pow, pow, pow. "Tell me your name." Pow. All night long. All night long. They fight. Until the light starts to get brighter in the east. And the stranger says, "You've got to let go of me. I've got to get out of here because the sun's going to come up and I don't want you to see my face." And Jacob says, "I'm not letting go of you. I'm going to see your face. I'm going to watch your lips move when you tell me what your name is." Pow. And the stranger says, "I'm not going to tell you what my name is, Jacob. I'm going to tell you what your new name is. From now on, everyone's going to call you Israel because you've been wrestling with God all night long." Jacob goes, "Whoa." The stranger says, "From now on, Jacob, you're going to have a new name. Everybody's going to call you Israel." This Hebrew word Israel is actually two different Hebrew words put together. The El part of the word is the Hebrew word for God in the job description kind of sense, personality that runs the whole universe. That El, or Elohim in plural, is the shows up in a lot of names, English names that come to us from the Hebrew language, like Samuel and Daniel and Michael and others. The Isra is the Hebrew word that means to wrestle with. The stranger says, "From now on, when people see you, they're going to say, 'That's that guy that wrestled with God.'" It's an interesting part of the Jacob stories in a lot of different ways, okay? Maybe most obvious to me is that Jacob believes that in the morning his brother is going to kill him. And what does he do all night long but wrestle with God? And it marks a turning point in the Jacob story. I told you this on Monday. Oftentimes in the story, something earth-shaking, psychologically shattering happens to one of the characters in the story, and the name has to be changed. The old name doesn't fit anymore. And here is a beautiful example of that going on here. The Hebrew word that shows up in English as Jacob literally means the trickster, the tricky guy. It comes from a tradition about Jacob's birth that these are twin brothers, right? And so they are they're being born. The midwife is there, and one of the babies One of the baby boys is born with his hand coming out first, enters the birth canal like this, and comes out like that. And so one of the midwives takes a red cord, a red string, and ties it around the hand so that they'll know which one was born first, because that's kind of important to know. And then pulls his arm back into the womb. In the story, the twins fight each other. You see where the story is going to end up, right? The twins fight each other, and then Esau is born, and then Jacob is born next. And so they give him the name Trickster, because he tricked them, right? He played a trick on him. Everybody thought he was going to be born first, but then Esau was born first. So they called him Trickster. They called him Jacob. As all too often happens, though, cute names are given to children when they're little. Those children grow up in those names in all kinds of ways that aren't so cute anymore. Some people have experienced, know what I'm talking about. Other people don't know what I'm talking about. Live long enough, you'll have plenty of examples of kids who are given cute little nicknames or family names that are real cute when they're little, and then not so cute when they're older. They grow into that name. And Jacob is a slimy character. Stealing his brother's blessing is not the only time he plays tricks on people. That's how he becomes so wealthy. He deceives people. He plays tricks on people. He's very deceptive. But after this experience, he's a different person, and that name doesn't fit anymore. And he's changed. In fact, in the story, he dislocates his hip in all this fighting, and it never heals, and he always has a limp for the rest of the story. I mean, this is a big event in understanding the character of Jacob. Anyway, and it's also an interesting name for these people to pick up and call themselves. You know, this new nation, they look for a name for themselves. Who are you people? We're the people that wrestle with God. We're the people who really do believe that we're in a relationship with God, where we have to get a little upset every once in a while, and maybe a little bit of anger. But that's okay because we want the relationship to work. We're the people who wrestle with God. It's an interesting name to give to yourself as a people. Who are you people? We're the people that wrestle with God. Well, back to the story here. David becomes the first undisputed king of this new country. In a world history course, we'd have some more things to say about David. Almost, I'm trying to come up, at least twice a year. Now we're on a big David roll. Archaeological evidence of materials from David's reign appears. 40 years ago, it would have been a very different story to talk about David. But in a world history course, we would have a lot more archaeological evidence to consider. David will make Israel a significant player in the Mesopotamian world. I mean, not a major power. They're still a very tiny group of people. But a significant military power, economic power. In a literature course, you might be reading some poetry attributed to David. For us in this course, probably most significant is that David in Hebrew literature becomes the symbol of the powerful king. As the first undisputed king of the nation and a king who makes this tiny group of people a significant military power in the region, he becomes a symbol of the powerful king, and we'll see evidence of that later on in the semester. Well, eventually David dies. There's yet another civil war fought over who's going to be the next king. But it's a very short civil war. It only lasts like a week. And David's son Solomon comes to the throne. In a world history course, we'd have some things to say about Solomon. He will take Israel to its greatest height of, for Solomon, especially economic influence. If you think of that map of Canaan in between Mesopotamia and Egypt, you see where it sits on a trade route there, a major economic power. In a literature course, you might be reading some of the wisdom literature attributed to Solomon. If you hear someone speaking about someone who's as wise as Solomon, this is the guy that they're talking about. He has a reputation for being very wise. He has a reputation for being very wealthy. If you hear someone referred to as being as wealthy as Solomon or as rich as Solomon, or if you read a story about the mines where King Solomon gets his wealth from, this is the guy they're talking about. For us in this course, probably most significant about Solomon is that he builds the city, which we've taken as a symbol of the Hebrew legacy, the city of Jerusalem. Which at the time of Solomon's, the start of Solomon's reign is pretty much a crossroads out in the middle of nowhere. There's pretty much nothing there. By the end of Solomon's reign, it will be an entire city built on top of a mountain. A city full of palaces and gardens and all that kind of stuff. There you have not the best map in the world, but the best one I could find, where the mountaintop kind of slopes up to the peak on the northern part, where Solomon builds a temple. The entire city, and I know it's hard to see, but the entire city kind of focuses our attention on the temple intentionally, the way that it's built. The temple, the first permanent place of worship in ancient Hebrew religion, or at least it was intended to be permanent. Before this point, there had been a tent that was carried from place to place for people to worship outside of. But Solomon has an idea, actually his father David had the idea of building a permanent place, or it was supposed to be permanent, a place of worship. And you can read a description of the temple in the Hebrew Bible, the tapestries and the statuary and so forth. Well, eventually Solomon dies, and there's, guess what, yet another civil war, who's going to be the next king. But here we have another interesting political solution to the problem, in which the nation just divides itself into half. You have two guys who want to be king, and so they decide to split themselves into half and avoid any further bloodshed. And the people enter a time period that historians refer to as the divided monarchy. It's an interesting time in which you have people who think of themselves as one family, and yet they've split themselves into two political units, two different nations, each with its own king. There's a couple, maybe just, no, there are two. There are two panopto presentations on the divided monarchy. Pretty quickly, just to summarize those two, pretty quickly, both these small nations are conquered by other empires. Alexander the Great, for example, we run into him again. The Roman Empire, we run into them again. And you have that discussion on actually two panoptos. The first one cuts off in the middle, I know that, but then it picks up in the next presentation.